Some of you may be just downright shocked to hear this, but I am not a morning person. Now, I can be pleasant enough and plenty capable of handling business, but I am an adult after all. But it should be no surprise that a 3 to 4 hour business meeting each morning of our annual Faith Affiliations General Assembly, which by the way began at 8 a.m., was pretty much an affront to my natural circadian rhythm. Nevertheless, I made my way across the various walkways, up and down escalators, in and out of the glorious air conditioning, and eventually waddled into the convention hall to find my place amongst our people. This General Assembly in particular was about building bridges with our interfaith colleagues, having invited many leaders from the Christian, Jewish, Muslim, and Buddhist faiths to be present and help lead workshops throughout the week. The message that we are better together was stressed in every event we attended, even the business meetings. On the first day, we sat through 2 hours of important recognitions, announcements, and business before the central speaker for the meeting was finally introduced. I had little to prepare myself for what I would hear, as my concentration was being broken intermittently by the need to applaud and the need to shift my aching hips on that uncomfortable seat. The Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II was introduced, and as Ian Cowie noted, he appeared pretty intense as he hyped himself up on the side of the stage. Reverend Barber is a Protestant minister at the Greenleaf Christian Church Disciples of Christ in Goldsboro, North Carolina. He's a stalwart advocate for the NAACP and chair of their Legislative Political Action Committee. He's led the Moral Monday civil rights protests in North Carolina. He's committed to justice, and while his credentials are impeccable, let me tell you, his ability to preach a message is enviable even by the most gifted orators. As I noted to the group I sat with after he finished, well, I guess I'll be keeping my day job, won't I? I knew, we all knew, that his message was worthy of sharing. I do not take for granted that this sermon was preached by Reverend Dr. Barber, an African American minister, to a convention center full of mostly white UUs. It will inevitably be different and have different implications coming from my mouth. But I present it to you now in the spirit that it was delivered, that together, black, brown, white, Asian, together we can achieve more. Without further ado, here's Reverend Barber's sermon. I want this morning to talk about how hate, discrimination, and violence cannot have the first, the last, or the loudest word. It seems as though hurt is all around us. June 12th was the 52nd anniversary of the killing of Medgar Evers, right in front of his family when he was shot, the day after John F. Kennedy declared that civil rights protections were not a Democratic issue or a Republican issue, but a moral issue. And on that same day, 52 years later, the Orlando massacre occurred. A complicated, crazed man began firing when he finished. 49 were dead, and he was killed. Mostly LGBTQ, 4 out of 5 Latinx, and many others were wounded, and the heart of the nation was shaken. 6 days ago, June 17th, at that time, was the 1-year anniversary when a race-crazed young man went in and shot 9 souls at Mother Emanuel in Charleston and fled to Shelby, North Carolina, the original home of the writer of Birth of a Nation, where hate militia groups are still known to reside. Hurt is all around us, and so much of this hurt is driven by hate. Racial hate, homophobic hate, religious hate, and the truth to be told, it has a long history of causing hurt. And right now, hate desires that we react with hate. And truth be told, when you are hurting, there is the possibility of succumbing to revengeful hate. But I believe today the tears are the order of the day. Prophetic mourning. the loss of life. We grieve the destruction and the hurt and the pain of those in Orlando, but also those across the nation. Many of our slaughtered and maimed siblings, yes, they were members of the LGBTQ community, members of the Latino community, but in the larger sense, we must say from our hearts, they were our community. And despite what those who promulgate hate and try to say to us, they remain members of our human family of love. And in death as they were in life, they were children of God, made in the image of God, and we must weep as one family. But while we cry, we must also gain our composure and not allow hate or cynicism to have the first, the last, or the loudest word. In the book I read of faith, it says in 1 John, those that give in to hate are blinded and do not know what they are doing. We cannot use hate, America, as the path through our pain and to our tomorrow, because hate fuels hate. Racial hate, homophobic hate, religious hate, class hate, and the rhetoric of hate that drives the terrorists and the mob and the racist and the homophobe. We cannot give in to the culture of hate. That is why I'm so concerned right now in this nation about the rhetoric of hate, because in reading history, I can remember when George Wallace began the rhetoric of hate in February, and he mainstreamed certain types of language that had been lost or been kept in the back room. Not that it was right in the back room, but he brought it into the mainstream, and by the end of '63, Medgar Evans was dead. 4 little girls in a Birmingham church were dead, and the president was dead. Hateful rhetoric that creates the culture of hate has always been the prerequisite to violence. Let's linger on that for a second. Hateful rhetoric that creates the culture of hate has always been the prerequisite to violence. And so we must stand in protest to hate, discrimination, and violence. We need a revival, a moral revolution of values in this nation, especially because there are those who have tried, as they have in the past, as they are now in the present, hijacked religion and used it in the service of hate and violence, and we cannot stand for it. That's why Dr. James Forbes and Sister Simone with Nuns on the Bus and Tracy Blackman and I have joined in a 22-city tour where we're supported by universities and friends in Reform Judaism and Quakerism and all other faiths. And why do I talk about hate, discrimination, and violence in the form of a trinity? Well, we must remember the wisdom of Coretta Scott King, when after her husband was murdered by hate, she was asked, what did she think about violence? And she answered, yes, I know violence. The violence of murder. But that's not the only type of violence. Poverty can produce the most deadly type of violence, she said. I remind you that a starving child is violence. Suppressing a culture is violence. Neglecting school children is violence. Discrimination against working people and not paying them a living wage is violence. Ghetto housing is violence. Ignoring medical needs is violence. Hurting and undermining the dreams and the destiny of children, whether they be Israeli or Palestinian, Native or American-born, whether they be Hindu or Muslim or Christian, whether they be Asian or black or white or brown, whether they be any inner city or gay or straight. Anytime we undermine their dreams or their destiny, that is a form of violence. Institutional and systemic racism, ignoring the poor, is a form of violence. And then she said, and I'll paraphrase here, even a lack of willpower to help humanity is a sick and sinister form of violence. Today we must mourn those killed in Orlando, and we must remember those killed in Charleston a year ago. But we must mourn and protest violence, discrimination, and hate in all of its forms. We must protest in a country where too much of our public life is being driven by market values rather than the values of our deepest religious faiths. We must mourn and protest the continued systemic racism, not just somebody simply calling you a racist word, but sometimes when they never use a racist word, but they pass policies that create a disparate impact against black and brown people. We must mourn and protest being in a country where we have seen some of the worst bills being passed against the LGBTQ community. And when we sing "God Bless America," God shed his grace on thee, and then we refuse to show grace to the LGBT community. We must mourn and protest the violence against working people in a country where 400 families make $97,000 an hour, and we're arresting people who want to simply fight for 15. We must mourn and protest violence when we have a country where states are still passing some of the worst immigration bills in the world, where children are literally being snatched from their schools, where politicians are promoting anti-immigration bills and they themselves come from immigrants. And their own family could not have come here if the rules that they want now had been in place then. We must protest where we have a country where we have states that have made it easier to get a gun than to vote. We must protest the violence. We're in a country now where we have less voting rights protection today than we had August 7th, 1965, just a few minutes after the blood of James Reeb was used to sign the Voting Rights Act of 1965. There is something wrong when we are marching backwards across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. We must protest the lock that the NRA has on too many of our politicians. That is violence. We must protest and we must mourn those who will abuse the Second Amendment that guarantees guns, but then will undermine the 14th Amendment that guarantees equal protection under the law. We must protest the violence of warmongering, where we continue to have leaders who want to send boys and girls to fight the wars of rich people over oil and not protect the lives of the poor, and have a real war on poverty here in America. Like Coretta Scott King taught us, we must speak out against all forms of hate, all discrimination, and all violence, because hate grows hate, discrimination grows discrimination, and violence grows violence. That's why I was glad to see John Lewis and others decide to sit in and sit down, because they are saying enough is enough. And so right now there is a call upon us to be visible signs of love, equality, justice, and nonviolence, so that hate, discrimination, and violence cannot have the first, the last, or the loudest words. And remember, right in the middle of some of the most violent days of South Africa, Bishop Desmond Tutu reminded the people not after the violence was over, but in the middle of it. He reminded them that victory is ours. Goodness is stronger than evil. Love is stronger than evil. Light is stronger than darkness. And life is stronger than death. And as we do this, we can do it with hope in love and nonviolence. No matter how bad it is right now, we're hurting. We have to, like the Sankofa bird, look backwards in order to go forwards. We don't have to use hate to get through this moment. Let's remember what others have done before us. During the 2.5 centuries of slavery, when the oppressor would kill white and black people out of hate whenever they heard the call of freedom, for the most part, the abolitionists and slaves did not return hate for hate. They kept on pressing for justice, declaring up above my head, I hear music in the air, there must be a God somewhere. In the 1800s, when riots began in places like Wilmington, and Gatling guns were brought into the city, 3 to 4% of the population was killed, blacks and progressive whites, more people killed per capita than on September 11th. They didn't respond with hate. They kept on focusing on love and justice and mercy, and they won the day. Hate spread in mob violence in the 1900s from New York to Springfield to South St. Louis to Charleston to Washington, D.C. In 1921 in Tulsa, some say over 300 black people were killed, burned 191 black businesses, 1,200 black homes, 10,000 African Americans were left homeless. But they didn't call for the hate, and the destruction of all white people. They found a way to get together with whites and blacks, and they kept working for justice and freedom. There is a way forward. In 1943, right after the war, there were 242 racial clashes in 47 cities. But for the most part, we didn't give up on the possibility of democracy. We didn't give in to hate. On Christmas night, 1951, Harry Moore and his wife were blown up on their anniversary on Christmas. But the people that were left after them didn't give in to hate. They didn't put bombs under everybody else's house. They didn't give everybody a bomb. They didn't say loosen the bomb laws. Instead, they said freedom never dies. Freedom never dies. No bomb can destroy our dream. Freedom never dies. When Mamie Till lost her son, she didn't call for the killing of all white men. She didn't call for a ban on all white men. She opened the casket and said, "Let the world see what racism would do." She showed the world her tears. And Rosa Parks saw those tears, and Rosa Parks didn't get a gun. She didn't get a Molotov cocktail. She sat down on the bus so that the civil rights movement could stand up. There is a way forward. When those 4 little girls were killed 17 days after the March on Washington, their parents didn't call for the destruction of everybody that happened to be white. What they did instead was they cried and they prayed, and students said, "If you kill those 4, hundreds of us will now arrive." And they went south and they killed Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman. They said, maybe if we kill a Jewish man, if we kill an African American, if we kill someone who is white, maybe the rest of the students will not come. But it was in their deaths that more people came. They refused to stay away. They never gave in to hate. 21 years ago, when a hate-crazed anti-government militia member detonated a bomb that killed 168 people, including children and infants in Oklahoma City, hate went into a rage. But those parents didn't call for us to find every militia member and go kill them, because they knew that hate only leads to more hate. Hate wants us to react in this moment. Hate wants us to be cynical in this moment. But we must remember that down through the years, people have faced the worst, and they still did not give in to the evil side of humanity. They suffered, but they refused to respond to hate with hate. And they believed that faith and love and nonviolence was still greater than hate. And so as I conclude, we cannot in this moment, my Unitarian friends, fall into hate's trap. We cannot become cynical. We cannot go hide behind our walls of quarantine. No, we cannot lose our faith and hope and justice. We cannot give in to the politics of hate. And we surely cannot do this. We cannot allow those who have stirred hate to now offer themselves up to be the savior of hate. Instead, those of us who have in our history the commonality of suffering from hate. But we also know from history that those who have won the day are those who chose love in the midst of hate. Those who chose not to let hate define their lives. Those who rose from the crucifixion of hate to the resurrection of love, truth, and justice. My brothers and sisters, this is the time that we must choose whether we will lash out with fear and division and petulance and hate, or whether we will embrace love more boldly and walk in truth and justice. I declare to you today, the time is now for us to join those who lived before us, who in the face of hate chose community, chose love, chose nonviolence, chose the way of justice. Let us say on our watch, we will speak up. We will stand up. We will come together and we will make sure that love, justice, equality, and nonviolence has the first, the last, and the loudest words. We will do it because together, together, together we shall overcome. May it be so.